I'm going to try to persuade you that God is science. And I'll get more into what I mean by that. I'm usually known as the caveman, and people associate me with the Paleolithic diet and things like that. And I'm actually not going to be speaking about the Paleolithic today. I want to speak about what came after. Because human evolution didn't stop in the Paleolithic. It never stops. And one of the most important things that happened after the agricultural revolution was the rise of culture. And what I'm going to present today is basically a hypothesis that the emergence of monotheism, particularly in Judaism, was actually a direct result of a scientifically sound hygiene code, which was a cultural adaptation to infectious disease, which was the greatest health problem of the early agricultural age. So the star of the show is really culture, and I mean culture in two ways. Culture in terms of ideas and practices and technology, and another use of culture as in a bacterial culture or microorganisms. And ideas and microbes are actually incredibly similar. They're very small, usually invisible. They spread in ingenious ways. Ideas use brains and books. Microbes use blood and insects. They mutate very quickly. They flourish. They sometimes seem like they have a life of their own, but we don't really view them as fully alive. And they flourish in large, dense networks. And so after, this is sort of a network diagram of, say, some hunter-gatherer tribes in the Paleolithic. There aren't very many people. They're very diffuse over the landscape. And with the rise of agriculture in cities and civilization, you get much larger networks of not just people, but domesticated animals, and more vectors, not just more hosts or nodes, but more vectors between them, whether that's people using the same well or and living in close proximity in a city. So, and cities are really where these two forms of culture explode. Ideas, cities have always been places of learning, and microorganisms. And early cities, really until the last 100 years, cities were incredibly filthy places. And it was very hard to actually live in them because you could easily contract something and die. If there's one group of people throughout history that has a reputation for thriving in cities, in this novel habitat produced by agriculture, it's the Jewish people. The Jewish people have a reputation for living in cities going back for millennia. And the Jewish tradition has very interesting ties to both forms of culture. The culture of ideas, the people of the book, and a very learned tradition and literate tradition, and the notion of microbes. The importance of hygiene, in particular in Judaism, is a very old theme. Things like hand washing and bathing. And so I'm going to continue to tie those two things together and show how they relate to one another. Like I said before, the theme of hygiene in Judaism is extremely old. It goes all the way back to the original text, the Torah, the Talmud, and many authors have written about it before. So a lot of what I'm going to be saying about hygiene today is not original to me. I'm synthesizing other people's work, so just keep that in mind. I do have a few original things in here, but they're more near the end. And I should say that while I've studied this subject for a few years, I don't speak Hebrew, I don't speak German, I wasn't raised Jewish, so there are many people, Professor Baden, who know more about aspects of this topic than I do, so just wanted to offer a little note of humility there. I do have one very important thing going for me, which is, that's the next slide. This theme of cleanliness is next to godliness, this religious proverb, really does unite in this long tradition these two forms of culture. Cleanliness and hygiene to combat infectious disease, and godliness and religious culture and ideas and practices. The one thing that I do have going for me in talking about this subject is that I look like a very famous Jew. So So I've got that going for me, which is nice. Or how people think that he looked. He probably did not actually look like this. So here's the hypothesis, just to get to it real quickly, and then we've got to zip through a lot of other slides real fast. First claim is around the concept of sin. If a person were to break a scientifically sound hygiene rule, such as touching a corpse, i.e. sin, then that person would be more likely to become infected and die. Or it might look like they're being punished by God and struck down. This is very uncontroversial. Early notions of sin are very tied to that which is clean and unclean. Claim 2, false gods. If praising other deities, false gods, encouraged unhygienic practices such as sacred prostitution, tattooing, cannibalism, or even just ignored hygienic practices like hand washing, those, quote, false gods actually would be functionally incompatible with a, quote, one true God who promulgated a scientifically sound hygiene code. So you might actually have a dynamic that would create an incentive and lead to the emergence of a God that really thought that he was right and all the other gods were wrong. Oh, there's the third claim. So I don't have time to go through all the things I'm not arguing. When I present this, a lot of people have different ideas about what I'm trying to say, and there's a lot of more subtlety here that I don't really have time to present, but I'd be happy to talk about that subtlety later over a drink. So claim number 1, sin. It's fairly uncontroversial that early notions of sin were closely tied to cleanliness. The law of Moses isn't just the 10 Commandments, the Mosaic Law. There's 613 rules. It's very complicated. A full 15 to 20% of them are the purity code, the hygiene code. That's a lot. Here are the general principles of the Jewish purity code. There are certain things that can make you unclean. That status is transferable through contact. There are certain purification rituals that you have to go through to become clean again, and it affects the entire community. This lines up pretty nicely with an intuitive notion of the germ theory of disease. Clean and unclean sources of infection, it's contagious. You have to decontaminate yourself through things like hand washing, and it affects the entire community. Public health measures to be effective require coordination among the entire population, such as like we see in sewer systems or vaccination programs. So some of the things that made you unclean. Signs of skin disease. How many people have read the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, cover to cover? Not a ton. Great, terrific. Excellent. Oh, yeah, good. Thank you, Professor. I'm glad, very relieved. Very relieved. You have a lot of work to do. Skin diseases, it's usually referred to as leprosy. It wasn't the actual modern condition that we refer to as leprosy, but a bunch of different skin diseases, bodily fluids. People are deathly afraid of bodily fluids. You'll often hear certain things taken out of context and ridiculed, like touching a menstruating woman made you unclean. Touching a man that had a seminal emission also made you unclean, so it was men too. And you think about back in the day before antibiotics or any knowledge of germs, a general skittishness around people secreting bodily fluids probably was a decent rule of thumb to avoid infection. Feces, there's this great piece in Deuteronomy that tells the Jewish soldiers that when they're at camp, if they have to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, they got to go way away from camp and dig a hole and cover their refuse. God wants this. God's very insistent that, and in wars, in most wars throughout history, more soldiers have been killed by disease than actual combat. So this is actually a pretty profound rule. No markings on the flesh, or cutting the flesh is a sign of mourning. So that's often been interpreted as no tattoos. As everyone knows, you can also get disease through that. This tattoo is very confusing to me. It doesn't work on multiple levels, so I agree with that injunction. I'm all for interfaith dialogue, but I can't support that. Corpses. You guys might get a little grossed out by a few of these pictures, and that's a little bit the idea. Corpses, couldn't touch corpses, human bones in graves. You have to bury people within 24 hours. That makes a lot of hygienic sense. You can't eat animals that die of their own accord. Animals that drop dead are usually infected ones, so that was a good rule of thumb. Cannibalism is out. Cannibalism was actually fairly common among pre-agricultural peoples. And then it switches from a way of venerating your dead ancestors to the ultimate sign of defilement. And that probably has a lot to do with the fact that as population density increased and infectious disease went through the roof, the people who were dropping dead were infected, and so eating them would be a good way to kill yourself. Certain animals, everybody talks about pork and shellfish. Forget pork and shellfish. The most important aspects of the Jewish dietary code, in my opinion, have nothing to do with pork and shellfish. You're supposed to stay away from vermin, most insects, and then it also prevents people from eating top-level predators and carnivores in the food chain, and those predators provide a useful service in the local ecology, which is disposing of corpses. And we know that people in that day and age explicitly understood that because in Zoroastrianism, a very similar and neighboring religion in Persia, around the same time, when people would die, their burial practice was to take people to a mountain, chain them down, and allow the corpses to be devoured by wild birds and dogs. And we know this in Egypt too. If you don't eat cat, well, you actually protect a top-level carnivore in your own diet because cats eat vermin, and so they became protected species in Egypt and many subsequent cultures down the road. Sex, pretty much any form of sex was unclean, and sex is a good way to contract an incurable STD. Infertility, if you look through the Bible, there are a lot of barren women. And one thing to think about every time you come across a barren woman in the Bible is it's possible that she had contracted, or the figures that it's based on, had contracted perhaps an incurable STD. There are parts of Africa that have been known as the sterile crescent, where upwards of 20% of women have been infertile due to pelvic inflammatory disease and chlamydia and gonorrhea left untreated. So it was a very big deal. We look at some of these sexual codes, it's very repressive and retrograde today, but if you put yourself in the context of an era where if you caught something, you had it for the rest of your life, and it might mean the end of your line, it was actually a big deal. And these things line up very nicely with what researchers have discovered as universal triggers of disgust. This is work done by Paul Rozin, Jonathan Haidt, and Clark Macaulay, the preeminent experts in the field of disgust. And people get disgust. Disgust is the most fascinating of human emotions. It's number one. I challenge you to find a human emotion that's more interesting. And disgust functions, as Steven Pinker has written, as sort of an intuitive microbiology. It keeps us away from potential sources of infection. Okay, I need to skip over some slides here. Transmission, there are all sorts of rules in the Bible and then interpreted in the Talmud about different ways that cleanliness and uncleanliness could be transmitted. But basically, it's pretty severe. It's the slightest physical contact can make something unclean. Well, that is more or less how germs can be transmitted. And there are different rules for liquids and open and closed spaces and what type of material you're dealing with. And then we get to the purification rituals. And it's really incredible that hand washing, the simplest and most effective form of hygiene ever discovered, Nobel-worthy, appears 3 times in the Torah. And sometimes it's targeted towards Jewish priests to wash their hands, but I don't think it's a coincidence that just as infectious disease is exploding, a God comes along that orders people to wash their hands as a way of praising him. Bathing, a bunch of other purification rituals I don't have time to talk about, but sterilization by fire is in there. Boiling was interpreted later in the Talmud as a method of sterilization. Quarantine is in there. The passage of time, sick people becoming well, hair removal and nail care. So what I really want to suggest is this: rather than having to wash your hands in order to pray, as you do in many religions, maybe it's that prayer emerged as a way to get people to wash their hands. And the Sabbath was a way of coordinating private hygiene and public health, kind of the same way that a parent orders children to brush their teeth twice a day, because otherwise these invisible things will destroy your health. And kids are like, I don't care about that. I don't want to brush my teeth. Well, you also had this big, powerful God that said, every 7 days you're going to come to my temple. My temple is clean, and I am clean, and I want you to be clean. And you must bathe, and you must wash your clothes, and you must wash your hands, and you must arrive clean. And just do it, or you will be punished by death. Jesus didn't wash his hands. This is one of the most amazing moments of the Bible when you realize that there's 3 parts in the New Testament, in 3 of the Gospels. One of his disagreements with the Pharisees was whether he should have to wash his hands before meals. So this is why Jesus was a radical. Jesus was a radical because he took Jewish moral principles, pre-existing Jewish moral principles, and he got rid of the purity code, which was the barrier preventing these moral principles from being extended universally. The purity code was what separated the in-group from the out-group, and he got rid of the purity code and spread the moral principles. Okay, moving on. So the basic dynamic of false gods, and I only have about a minute here, so I got to go real fast. The best example of how a one true God could come in conflict with false gods happened in the 20th century around cannibalism in New Guinea. There was a tribe that did cannibalism to honor their dead ancestors. They started contracting a prion disease from eating the brains. And basically, anthropologists figured out what was going on. They said, no, you can't do that tradition anymore. It's killing you. So in a sense, this one true God of science was coming in conflict with the old gods, particularly around infectious disease. And then in terms of if a people follows these rules, will they be favored by God? There's actually a lot of data on this. A lot of Jewish physicians have studied Jewish health throughout the years, and almost everywhere and in all the periods for which statistical data are available, the mortality of the Jews was considerably lower than that of surrounding populations, primarily due to a lower infectious disease burden. Unprecedented tenacity of life, even though Jews had a reputation for not being physically robust, and because they tended to live in cities which are places that are conducive, and crowded urban ghettos, places conducive to the spread of disease. There are unverified reports and rumors of Jewish ability to relative imperviousness to plague, stretching back into antiquity. You have a bunch in Europe going back to the Black Death, where Jews were scapegoated and blamed for the Black Death for poisoning wells. I'm still trying to find data on whether there actually was differential mortality. But if you went back to that era and tried to recommend to people what they could do to avoid the Black Death, it would be things like staying away from corpses, washing your hands, not getting in touch with bodily fluids, staying away from insects and vermin. Things that an observant Jewish person would have been doing. And it really goes all the way back to the origin story of the Jewish people, which is the plagues of Egypt. I'm not making a comment about the actual historical, the alleged historical events, but it really is a people born in plague and disease, and soon after they have this miraculous ability to avoid disease, their God orders their priests to wash their hands a lot. And so, in some sense, I would say that this may be a picture of God. When in the work that the Gates Foundation does in the developing world, primarily to combat infectious disease and improve public health, they're focusing on a lot of the same areas related that you might find if you flip open to Leviticus. Toilets, bathing, insects, sexual practice, condoms. It's no longer really kosher to tell people how to live their sexual lives, but condoms are a way of preventing the spread of disease, hand washing, clean water. So when Mr. Gates goes on a vaccination campaign or goes into different areas, they often run into opposition from local religious groups whose rules and practices are coming in conflict with scientifically sound hygiene. And it may be this dynamic that explains the emergence of a faceless, nameless, abstract, rule-bound, complicated monotheistic God. And there are a lot of different implications around this that I'd be happy to talk about over a drink if anybody is interested. So, and I write about that in my book. So my book isn't just a Paleolithic diet book. It's also about a broader sweep of human health over the course of human evolution. So thank you very much.